It's time for the Double Stop with Brian Sword.
Welcome to the Double Stop. I'm Brian Sword, and welcome back after a much-needed week off. This week on the show, I have Jonathan Mover, who was in GTR in his early 20s, spent about 10 years playing with Joe Satriani, has had a whole bunch of other cool gigs, and now even runs a magazine, as well as playing with Saigon Kick. Now this is a long one, a full 90-minute show, so hopefully that makes up for the week off. Now one thing before we start, I must say, I don't think I've ever had any guest with such a knack for remembering people's names like Jonathan. It's almost uncanny. He remembered everybody and even caught himself while talking, kind of surprised that he knows their name, but he remembered them. So anyway, you'll find out what I'm talking about in a sec. This is the story of Jonathan Mover.
Okay, well, I'm from the North Shore of Massachusetts, in a small town called Peabody. Most people would probably say Peabody, but we that are from Peabody say Peabody. And it's about 20 minutes north of Boston, on the way to Gloucester, on the coast. And musical family, yes, there's definitely some music in my family. On my father's side, he played trumpet and valve trombone. He was a pickup guy in the Boston area. Played with Rudy Valley and the Ink Spots and those type of people, and there was some other music on his side of the family too. But as far as the immediate family of me and my siblings, I'm the only one that took to music, and strangely enough, I'm the only one that my parents didn't really kind of push it on. I was a bit of a black sheep, you might say, and they just left me alone to my own devices to do what I wanted to do and, explore the things that I wanted to explore. And I was the one that came back to them and said that I wanted to play drums.
What age were you then when you started exploring music then?
I actually started exploring twice. The first time, well, actually not true, 3 times. The first time what got me interested in music to begin with was when I was, I guess, 6 or 7 years old, because I was born in 1963. And I believe it was 1969 or 1970 that it came out, was I saw an animated film on television called The Point by Harry Nilsson. And that really blew my mind and completely consumed me. My parents got me the record, and that was the very first record that I ever owned. And that got me interested in music. I wouldn't necessarily say that I gravitated towards any particular instrument, but I know for sure that the grooves of the record did, get me, and kind of the soundscapes of the record got me. It was a few years later that I decided that I wanted to play drums upon hearing In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. And when I heard the drum solo in that, it flipped me out and I made my decision. I think I was in, I want to say 3rd or 4th grade at the time, so I would have been about 10. And instead of signing me up for drum lessons, I just, did the elementary school, band orchestra, which was a dreadful experience. Nobody could play at that age, let alone me. But I found myself standing up at a snare drum with a couple of sticks the size of small baseball bats instead of sitting down, on a drum kit and rocking out, which is what I wanted to do. So I hung in there for a bit, and then I kind of gave up on it. And then a few years later, from what I recall, it was hearing Emerson, Lake and Palmer. When I heard Lucky Man, the outro on the Moog, the solo that Emerson played, really got me interested in the song and keyboards. And then when I listened to the record and I heard Carl Palmer's drumming, I decided once again I wanted to investigate drums. And at that point, I was about 13 and a half years old, and I got my parents, I convinced them, to sign me up for some drum lessons. And I studied locally with a drum teacher in Peabody named Don Carr, who was really great because he would end every lesson allowing me to play to a song. So, 80-90% of the lesson was working on rudiments and stickings and, different dance beats and rock beats and all of the basics. But then, at the 55th minute, I was able to put on a song and I could rock out on a drum pad kit. And, he would kind of help me along. And I distinctly remember playing to Siberian Khatru from Yes and Won't Get Fooled Again from The Who and a lot of the music that I was into at the time. And so that was really, I guess there were three beginnings to my playing drums or getting into music, but the last one was the one that stuck.
I think it's so funny that you had parents who were pushing music on their kids and they finally left you alone and you got it yourself and then you chose drums.
Yeah, really the nightmare of all parents. And it was actually, there's a funny story that I just saw my folks a couple of weeks ago. It was their 62nd anniversary, and we were joking around because, I did take some lessons, and I wanted a serious drum kit. I had a loaner from some neighbors, and I really was getting serious about it, and I wanted to invest. Well, I should say I wanted them to buy me one. That was their investment. And I wrote up a contract actually for my father at 13 years old that said, this is a bet between the two of us that I'm not only going to not give up playing drums, but I'm going to make it and be a rock star. And my father signed it. I hope I lose this bet. And then he put his name on it. And that was a long time ago.
Awesome.
Almost 40 years.
And then in terms of your lessons, how important do you think it was to have a teacher that let you rock out at the end just to keep your interest up instead of just doing patterns the whole time?
It was really important for somebody like me because I was playing drums because I wanted to play music, not because I wanted to just sit on a drum kit and beat them up. For me, playing to music and playing to records and making music was always what came first. Of course, I did put in my time of, serious practice and tuition of just working on, stickings and rudiments and linear and stuff like that. But a big part of my own practice routine was headphones on playing to records. And then what I would do is I would work in what I was trying to learn within the framework of the song that I was playing to. And that way, to me, it was always musical and it always made sense. And it always gave me the platform to be able to use it later on rather than just be in the basement working on something, over and over and over again, and then you find yourself with a bunch of guys, a weekend later at a gig or practicing, you don't know how to use what you were working on. So to me, music was always in the background, and the few teachers that I did have were all very music based in that sense. And so I think it was very important for me, for sure.
How long was it until you started joining bands, and what kind of music were you doing then?
It was pretty quick. Without sounding egocentric or anything, drums came to me quite naturally. When I first did pick up sticks and sit down to play on a kit, I had the fundamentals of, what hand and what foot had to do what. And way before the kit, when I was 10 and I heard Inagata Davida, I had a pair of sticks and I used to kneel down on the living room floor. And basically, I ended up beating a hole into the carpet, playing along to the record. So rhythmically, I could kind of follow it. And within about 6 months, I was playing with a couple of kids from school. And it was, I guess you'd call it a dance band. It was 2 saxophones and 2 trumpets. And we did some gigs, in local churches and temples and old folks' homes, a type of things. And but it was also my very first lesson in the discipline and the passion of what I had and felt, and the others didn't. Because I recall it being a very short-lived band because I was really pushing them to learn new things and to practice more and to, hone our skills individually and as a unit. And the other guys really weren't into it. And I can distinctly remember being, 13 and a half, 14 years old and having some verbal fights and everything, and it didn't last long. But I was playing, with local guys all through high school. But to be honest with you, I didn't play out an awful lot. Most of the guys in my age group at that time, were playing and practicing to pretty basic rock and roll, and not really getting anywhere with it. And for me, I was much more into staying at home and with headphones on, practicing to Zappa and Zeppelin and Genesis and Jethro Tull and Gentle Giant, yes, ELP, UK, Crimson, all of that stuff, Jeff Beck. And and I think that for me, again, that was a really good thing because it held my interest. No offense to bands like Aerosmith and Bad Company, who I've grown to love and appreciate much more as I got older. But at 14 and a half, 15 years old, the choice between playing Dream On and playing Titties and Beer, which is a Zappa tune with odd time and crazy stuff going on, I always wanted to stay in and play the challenging stuff. I didn't want to go out and play simple rock. So I did play out a little bit when I was in high school, filling in for some bands that needed drums, but I never really did, the local circuit that everybody else was doing.
So after high school, then what moves did you decide to make?
I did a very short stint at Berkeley, Berkeley College of Music, not Berkeley up in California, although I probably would have done better up in Berkeley, California. And I say that only because, and I take the blame for it. In my senior year or so, 1980, 81, actually it would have been 79, when Joe's Garage came out, which is a Zappa record that really blew my mind and changed my life. It was the first time I heard a drummer named Vinnie Colaiuta. And up until that point, I was into Bozio and Simon Phillips and Steve Gadd, Andy Newmark, Dave Maddox and all of those guys. But all of a sudden, this new Zappa record came out, and I heard things drumming-wise and rhythmically on that record that I'd never heard before. Even with some of the most difficult music I was playing, like Mahavishnu Orchestra, nothing came close to the polyrhythms that Zappa was doing and that Vinny was playing. And so with a little bit of research that I did on my new drum hero, I found out that he had gone to Berkeley and he had studied with somebody named Gary Chaffee. And Gary Chaffee had also taught or worked with Steve Smith from Journey, Jean-Luc Ponty, and Casey Sherrill from Jean-Luc Ponty and Gino Vanelli, Kenwood Denard, and a bunch of really amazing drummers that I was very much into. So without researching things enough, I applied to Berkeley, got accepted and auditioned, and I went there not realizing that Gary had already left the school a couple of years before that. So although I'm sure there was a lot to offer me at the school, I was pretty disgruntled when I showed up and didn't find Chaffee there. But there was a drummer that I ended up meeting one day, and I asked him about Gary, and he told me that Gary was teaching privately. I think it was in Roxbury at the time. And so I contacted Gary, and he accepted me to audition for lessons. And then when I auditioned, he accepted me for lessons. And I took one lesson a week, which was an hour each lesson. And within 3 weeks, I was then doing 3 hours each week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, back and forth to Roxbury from Peabody, working out of each of his books. And I really felt that my time was going to be much better spent putting everything into Chaffee. And I decided to leave Berkeley. And I studied with Gary for about a solid 6 months through to, I guess it was the spring of '82. I think it was April or May. And that was when I took my first trip to London to investigate a band and audition for them. And that was really the beginning of, I guess, my foot into the door of a professional career beyond New England. Because towards the end of my high school years, I was actually touring and playing professionally in a band called ITMB, which stood for the Incredible Two-Man Band. And at one point, it was the highest paid unsigned act in New England. And I missed quite a bit of my senior year because I was, playing out a lot, like Thursdays through Sundays or Wednesday nights through Sunday. From Montreal down to like Washington, D.C., and then a little bit of crossing up. So I had a taste of what it was like playing to 1,000, 2,000, sometimes 3,000 people in the clubs back then, which was, of course, very exciting. But going to England and auditioning for a band called Toyah, which was Toyah Wilcox, now the wife of Robert Fripp from King Crimson, was my first kind of foray out there.
And how would you get that lead to go to London to investigate that band?
I lied.
Right.
Yeah, plain and simply. I had met Simon Phillips. Well, it's a white lie. I wouldn't call it a bad one, but I had met Simon Phillips, who is one of my dearest friends now, but he really was, for the most part, my biggest singular hero of drumming when I was a kid, and still he blows my mind. But I met him when he was over here in the States doing a drum clinic tour. And I was very lucky that I showed up early and met him in the shop that was sponsoring the tour. And he asked me if I wanted to come over to the venue, which was at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and hang with him and help him set up his kit. And I got like 4 or 5 hours alone with Simon, got to talk to him about a bunch of things. And he had told me one of the records and tours that he had recently done was with this band called Toyah, which of course I had never heard about because they weren't released in the States. And shortly after that, I ordered the imports and I got the records, and I really fell in love with the music and the band. And now back then, before the internet, you really had to be creative, but it was actually pretty easy to get information because so many people weren't doing it that I literally just picked up the phone one day and I called information in London and I asked for EG records. I got EG records. I called them up and wanted to know who was in charge of handling Toyah. And I ended up speaking to Toyah's manager. Her name was Corinne Osborne. All of this stuff is tucked in my head somewhere. So I was speaking to Corinne Osborne, and I said, oh yeah, I'm a friend of Simon Phillips. I'm an American session drummer. Mind you, I'm like 17 or 18 years old at the time. And I said, I'm on my way over to London to do some session work, and, I know that Simon is not playing with Toyah anymore. If she's looking for a drummer, I'd like to put my name in. And, 1 + 1 = 2. She basically said, yeah, we're going to need somebody. Give us a call when you're over. And so I booked a ticket, and, I told them that I was there for doing other work, but I really wasn't. And called them when I got over there. I ended up auditioning, and I played with them, which was a blast. And it went really well. The next day, Corinne called me back, and she said, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is, Toyah, the band really liked your playing and would like to continue playing with you. The bad news is Toyah just got offered her first major acting gig doing a movie with Sir Laurence Olivier, and so they're going to shelve the band for a year. So, we'll talk to you in 365 days. And so that's pretty much where they left it. I stayed around London for a little while, and if memory serves me correct, I came back here because I ended up recording near Washington, D.C., or outside of Baltimore, through a bass player friend of mine in Boston. I ended up playing on a solo record for a guitar player named Punky Meadows, who used to play for a band called Angel. And I knew of Punky Meadows for two reasons, because Zappa wrote a parody about him called Punky's Whips, which is a brilliant song that Terry Bozzio plays and sings lead on, and it's just amazing. And of course, I believe I had seen Angel years before at the Orpheum in Boston when I'd gone to see, Rush or Styx or Kansas, one of the, the more American, although they're Canadian, but, one of the North American progressive rock bands that I went to see had Angel open up for them, and I remember seeing them. So I did the gig with Punky, and I did some recording. And then one thing led to another, and I got a call one day from the manager of a band called Marillion. And the producer of Marillion was producing Toyah. And Marillion needed a drummer, yeah. And then the bass player or guitar player, I think it was the bass player of Toyah, said, oh, we played with this young American kid who's really into progressive rock. You should give him a call. And a quick ending to the story was, before I flew over to London to audition for them, they came to New York. I was still in Peabody, but they came to New York, and they were opening up for Rush for 5 nights at Radio City. And so they invited me down to New York to meet them in person and just kind of, play some music and talk about things to see if we would get along. And so I went to the Rush gig, and they got booed off the stage and pelted with, pennies and, anything from tomatoes to whatever anybody had. And I remember saying to myself, oh my God, do I really want to go for this? But I met the band, and I flew to London about a week or two later. and I auditioned on a Wednesday. I got the gig Thursday. We flew to Germany and we did a live record on Friday night, and that was really, that was the gig that opened the door to me having a little bit of a name, and then at least establishing something professional enough that because I stayed in England for a while, with other people, when I said, oh yeah, I played with Marillion, that at least, caught the attention of some others. Yeah. So that was kind of like really the beginning of my real professional foot in the door.
How long did you play with them?
I did not play very long at all. My it was one of the other big learning experiences of the music business and what it does. I think I lasted with them maybe 4 or 5, 6 weeks. For various reasons, I had a falling out with the lead singer while we were at Rockfield Studios in Wales, writing and recording, working on what was going to be the second record, Fugazi. And so I'd co-written some material with them, and things were going quite well. And then something went down, and we butted heads. Even though I was, 5'10" and he was 6'6" and weighed, three times my body weight, I opened up my mouth when I should have, and I'm not sorry that I did. And while I was sleeping that night, he basically told the band it's him or me, and of course, it was going to be me because he was the lead singer of the band and everything was based on him. So I got my walking papers the next morning, which was a very, very big surprise and a real blow to me at the time. But, we're friendly now, and in hindsight, I have thanked him because my next step was the guy that ended up getting the gig after me was somebody who also auditioned back when I did. And for whatever their reasons were, they gave the gig to me, but they got a drummer named Ian Mosley. So when I found out that they had taken Ian after they let me go, Ian Mosley was playing. I knew who Ian was because he was Steve Hackett's drummer. Steve Hackett is the guitar player with Genesis. And, being a big Genesis fan, I had all the Hackett solo records too, so I was familiar with Ian. I called up Hackett's manager, and I said, I heard that Ian Mosley got the gig with Marillion, which I'm assuming means that Steve has a vacancy for a drummer. And, if there's an opening, I'd like to put my name in. And he said, oh, we just finished auditioning for a few weeks and Steve chose somebody yesterday. Sorry about that, but thanks very much. And we hung up the phone. And I picked up the phone and I called him back about 5 minutes later. And I said, could you please relay a message to Steve? Could you tell him to give me an hour in a rehearsal studio? And if I get the gig, he pays for the room. And if I don't get the gig, I'll pay for the room. And the manager hung up and called me back a few minutes later and said, Steve Hackett says you have big balls. He'll see you tomorrow at 12 o'clock. And I got the gig with Hackett.
These big balls have served you well.
They've gotten me in trouble, but yes, they have served me well. So I can't complain, but I've certainly learned some good lessons throughout my years. I know better when to keep my mouth shut now than when I was younger.
And in terms of that audition and the way you set it up, how was it when you stepped into that room?
It was cool. I mean, it was really great because, again, I was a big fan and I knew his music, which was fairly complicated, but I knew it like the back of my hand. And, we met, shook hands. He was very, very nice, as he still is today. We just had dinner in London about 3 weeks ago. And, he was just like, let's jam, let's see what happens. And I sat down. The first thing that he started playing was a song in 13/16 off of one of his records that I knew very well. And we just started knocking it out of the park for about a minute or two, having some fun. He then threw something at me in 11, and we did that for a little bit. And and then it's the only time in my life I've ever smoked tobacco. And I'm certainly not an advocate for any drugs because I really don't do anything. But he stopped playing and he said, wonderful, the gig is yours. You want to smoke a joint? And I said, yeah, thinking it was, pot. And so he lit up, an English joint and handed it to me, which I didn't realize was tobacco with a little sprinkling of hash. And I took a big suck on it and I went down to the ground like I just, swallowed a fire. And that was my introduction, my first and last ever puff of tobacco. But I got the gig, and the rest is history.
It
So
didn't
hopefully,
scare him off.
no, it didn't. We had a blast. We laughed a lot about it, and he's a great guy. We go back a long way, and he's very cool.
That audition, was that for GTR or did that kind of come later?
No, actually, that was another phone call a month later with good news and bad news. It was for his next solo record and tour, and so it was right before Christmas that I got the gig, and he invited me to his Christmas party. And, I took the train down and showed up. He had a beautiful home in Richmond at the time. And showed up for the Christmas party. And 10, 15 minutes into it, I'm talking to Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford, completely flipping out. And then Chester Thompson walks through the door. And I just can't believe that I'm hanging with, the gods of Genesis. Phil didn't show, but that's okay. The other guys were there. And then I met the guys in his solo band. And so we all had a great chat about, the tour that was going to come up and the next record we were going to do. And so everything was looking great. And I don't know, a few days or a week later, Hackett called me up and he basically said, I have good news and bad news. And I said, okay, give me the bad news first. And he said, well, I've disbanded the band. There's no next record and there's no tour coming up. And I said, okay, great. What's the good news? I bumped into Steve Howe, and we're going to do a new supergroup version of the Yardbirds with 2 guitars, and we would like you to play drums. And so that was the beginning of GTR.
And I'm trying to wrap my head around that because you're still essentially a kid. I don't know, maybe you're 20 by then?
Yeah, that would have been early. Oh yeah, that was, I guess, the winter of 83 going into 84. So I was 20. Yeah.
There you go. You're 20 years old and you're in that band. It just kind of makes my head spin a bit. Like, how was that?
It was awesome. I mean, are you kidding? The first day that we,
can't even imagine.
Actually, it was really funny. It brought on 2 very distinct emotions that diametrically couldn't have been further apart. The first day that the 3 of us got together in a room, just the 2 Steves and I, and we started playing some riffs and throwing ideas around, it was absolutely a dream come true. I mean, it was the old pinch myself in my dreaming. I'm sitting here playing with the guitar players from Genesis and Yes, which up until, probably 3 months ago, I was in my basement practicing to their records. But the thing that was really strange was I was disappointed that Bill Bruford and Phil Collins weren't there, because when I was growing up practicing to Genesis and Yes records, I was, envisioning that I was next to Phil and Bill and Alan White, playing at the same time, part of the situation. And it really never dawned on me that, hey, if I ever got the gig with Genesis, well, Phil wouldn't be there, and nor would Bill. So it was a little strange. It was, it was amazing. And of course, I was very happy to be there. But that was the reality of, wow, I'm finally going to be working amongst the people I've always wanted to work amongst and dreamed about playing with. But the reality is, the reason why I love them so much, that element is missing. If I play with Toyah, Simon Phillips isn't going to be there. If I play with Yes, Bill Bruford's not going to be there. So no complaints, but that was a little bit of a reality check when that happened. It was funny.
And that album did really well, and it had a hit song, and then it was over. What happened?
Again, talk about a lesson in the industry. It was really just, Yes had one way of doing things and Genesis had another. And from very early on in the recording process, not the rehearsal process, I could definitely see the unraveling, beginning. And most of it was because of no offense, he's a nice guy and we're friendly, but it was the wrong choice of a producer. Jeff Downs, who convinced us that he was the equal to Trevor Horn, because of course they played together in the Buggles, and Trevor is just a genius in King Midas, and Jeffrey's a great keyboard player, but he really wasn't a great producer in the sense of what we needed. And he also had an alliance with Steve Howe because of their years with Yes. And you could tell in many, instances where the ball went to Howe's court instead of Hackett's. And so when we were in rehearsals and we were working on writing the record, it was a very progressive record. Most of the record was odd time, had a lot of over-the-top playing with, big epic breakdowns, and it was very much arranged in the fashion of the not pop Genesis or Yes. But I believe Jeffrey and probably Steve Howe had it in their minds, along with the record label, that we could be the new Asia instead of being what we were when we began. And so the first week that we were in the studio, we laid down all of the basic tracks, all the rhythm tracks, and myself and the bass player, Phil Spaulding, we were done with everything in about 4 days. Drums, percussion, overdubs, bass were finished. And so at the time, I hung out for a little bit, but it was really quite boring at the time because they were taking so long to do everything else. I ended up taking a vacation, and I went trekking across Europe a bit with my girlfriend at the time. And when I came back to the studio maybe a month later, they had, well, not they, but Jeffrey had sliced and diced most of the progressive parts of the record out, and it had become very pop. So, songs that had some great little twists and turns in 9 or 11 were now in 4/4, and some big double bass sections were removed, and some, big drum fills and some breakdowns, rhythmic things that we were doing with guitar, bass, and drums were no longer there, and it wasn't a pleasant day. But I ended up, hanging in there with Hackett's support, and but it was a problem. The record, it did sell well, but it did not sell anything compared to what they were hoping an Asia Junior or Asia Volume 2 was going to be. And by the time we hit the road, the two Steves were traveling separately. They weren't speaking very much. Steve had his own, Steve Hackett had his own tour manager, and Steve Howe had his own tour manager, and it was a wonderful experience for me. It was an amazing tour. It was an incredible way to really break open into the international scene as a professional drummer, but it was very disconcerting, and it was really heartbreaking that nobody was speaking and nobody was getting along. And so there were 3 camps. There was Steve Howe's camp, there was Steve Hackett's camp, and then there was myself, Phil Max, and the keyboard player. And I was very happy and friendly with both Steves, but it was never everybody together. And so we finished up the tour, America, Canada, and Europe. We took a little bit of a break, and then we reconvened at Steve Howe's studio in Devon, started writing for the second record, which is a drag that it never went anywhere because the music was really great. It was very much along the lines of what we were doing on the first record that got, dissected and sliced up. But Hackett didn't show. He called me up a week or so later and he said, "Look, I'm not into it and I don't want to do it. I'm going to go back to doing my own thing and I would like you to come with me." And I said, I really appreciate it, but it's not what I signed up for on either level, and I think I need a break from both of you guys. So I called it quits, and I came back to the States, and the next thing I knew, I, by chance, ended up meeting Joe Satriani, which turned into 10 more years of a lot of records and tours.
And at that point for Joe, that's probably right after Surfing with the Alien then?
Yeah, actually it was before Surfing came out. It was after Not of This Earth, and the reason we met was on the GTR tour, I was endorsed in playing a drum company called Gretsch, and amazing drums. I mean, all of the best players at some point in time played Gretsch, from Tony Williams to Vinny, Terry Bozzio, everybody, but they just didn't have it together business-wise as far as the company went, and I just had some things that weren't working out on the road, so my choice of where I wanted to go is to play a company called Tama. And Tama is owned by a company called Hoshino, which also makes Ibanez guitars. And so I came back to the States to visit my folks in Mass, and Tama flew me down to Philadelphia to meet everybody and to woo me into signing. And they did a great job of it. I had a wonderful day with them. I signed with them at the end of the day. And as I was waiting to leave with the guys to go out to dinner, there was another somewhat long-haired, rock musician-looking guy, also waiting to go out with the guitar people, and we just started talking, and it was Joe. And he knew who I was because of GTR, but didn't really know me. And he just happened to say, what are you doing next month? I'm showcasing, my signing with Ibanez at the NAMM show in Chicago, and I've got a gig to do with Steve Vai at the Limelight, and I need a drummer. And I said, yeah, great. I'm going to go there for Thomas, so we'll play. And we did the one gig, and I didn't think anything more of it. As a matter of fact, after the gig, I split. I had a girl that I knew in Chicago, and I didn't go out to dinner with any of the guys. She was the manager of the Limelight, and I split with her, and that was the end of it. And then maybe a month or two later, Joe called me up and said, Ibanez Hoshino would like us to play at the Tokyo Music Fair. Do you want to do a week in Japan? We went over, and while we were in Japan, Surfing came out, or it had just come out, but it hit the charts. And I remember Joe, one day saying to me and Stu, you're not going to believe this, but my record is, like in the top 200. It's the highest charting instrumental guitar record since Jeff Beck's Blow by Blow. Are you guys interested in maybe doing a few weeks on the road? And that was really the beginning of all of it.
And for that tour with Joe, it's kind of hard to imagine nowadays a guitar instrumental record doing so well, because times have sadly changed so much. But back in that time, what kind of tour would that have been like to have a hit record instrumental guitar?
Well, it was an interesting tour for, three reasons. The first reason, it was great because we were really ripping it up. It was just the three of us, and we were, on fusion steroids every night. We were really taking it out. We were playing over the top. We were throwing in polyrhythms and rearranging tunes, and we were all having a real blast and just kind of, shoving the music down everybody's throats, and everybody was loving it. So in that respect, it was really great. It was also brutal because the record was doing so well when we hit the road that most of the clubs were doubling the nights, doubling the shows per night. And I remember at one point, my hands were literally bloody after 3 or 4 nights because we did 12 shows in 6 days.
Oh,
and
interesting.
Yeah, it was just brutal, all of us. I mean, we were all full of blisters and calluses and cracks, and buying super glue and things and tape just to keep our hands working. But the other thing that happened, which was just sheer luck and incredible being at the right place at the right time, Mick Jagger was in New York while we were playing this string of double shows at the Bottom Line. And Simon Phillips, who I was already at this point very close to, came down to see us play with Doug Wimbish and a couple of the guys from the band. And Jeff Beck was playing with Mick Jagger at the time. This is when, Mick and Keith had their big split, and Mick was, announcing to the world that he was going to do a big solo record and tour. And so that came down to the gig, and I believe it was the next day at Jagger's rehearsals. Legend has it that they were in the middle of a tune, and Jeff Beck just basically walked over to his amp, unplugged his guitar, walked out, and never came back in, and never told anybody he was leaving. And so we got a last-minute call that Jagger wanted to come down and see Joe because Simon and Doug Wimbish had told him about the gig that they saw with us the night before. So Mick came down to the Bottom Line and came up and played a few tunes with us. We jammed with him, which was thrilling.
Yeah,
and then it was amazing. And the next day, they called Joe and said the gig is yours. So we actually did about 2 more weeks of the tour, and then we took a break while Joe went out and hit it with Mick. And I think one of the things that I think Joe would also agree to. That was so amazing and such an incredible thing to happen to him is, when the music world found out that Beck had split, everybody wondered, what guitar player could possibly come in and replace him. And, every guitar player was calling. The next thing you know, this unknown guy from San Francisco gets the gig, and CNN did a story on it, and all of a sudden it took off like wildfire. So by the time Joe came back, we got upgraded from a lousy van and double shows every night to our first tour bus and bigger clubs and single shows and a road crew, and it was the launch of a much better, scenario.
And how long did you play with Joe? Was it mainly touring for the next few years?
It was off and on for about 10 years, and in that time, I think there were 3 records that I worked on and 4 or maybe 5 tours. I did leave in '89 to go to the Soviet Union and play with a South African band for about 3 months, and after that, I went straight into Alice Cooper's Trash tour. And so I did take a hiatus for a while, although I did a little bit of recording with Joe for the Flying in a Blue Dream record. The whole thing was halted early on when his father got ill. And so I ended up not even coming back to do anything more after what I did initially. And I went off to do those 2 tours while Joe was doing other things. And then when I had a break with Alice, I decided to go back with Joe to do the Flying tour. But then after that tour, I left again and ended up working with Aretha Franklin for about 2.5 years. And that's when Joe was doing The Extremist with the Bissonette brothers. And then I went back again to do the tour that was 95, 96. And I think that was just called Joe Satriani or something, because that record that he put out with the reddish cover was just called Satriani. And that was the last tour I did with him. So it was 87 to 96.
Now, to go from Joe Satriani to Aretha Franklin, that's such an interesting switch. What did you get out of that? Because I would imagine it's such a different style of music, that it's such a different part of your brain, that it must have given you something too.
Well, it was a blessing and a curse, to be honest with you. And it was the same blessing and curse that the South African band that I went to the Soviet Union kind of, bestowed me. And the funny thing about Aretha was, it was in April. It was a beautiful spring day. I was down in New York City where I used to live, and I was out riding my Harley one day on a Friday, and I came back at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was a message on my machine from a guy named Andrew Holt. Once again, I don't know where this stuff is tucked away, but some guy from Arista Records named Andrew Holt left me a message that said, "We're looking for Jonathan Mover. Can you call us back and get up to Boston to sight read a gig with Aretha Franklin tonight?" And I thought it was a joke, or, they must have made some mistake. So I called the guy back, and sure enough, he picked up the phone at Arista, and I said, "I think you're looking for Jonathan Moffett. He's the black R&B drummer that played with, Madonna and the Jackson 5 and everybody. I'm Jonathan Mover with, long hair down on my ass and a bunch of earrings, and I play hard rock and fusion." And he said, "No, we know who you are, and we need you to fill in. Can you get up there?" So I grabbed my sticks and I hopped the flight straight up to Boston. I did not meet Aretha before the gig, because I got there about a half an hour prior to going on. And I got the book of charts and had a quick look through everything. Got on stage, played the gig. It was an amazing experience. And after the show, I ran up to Aretha before I left, and I just said, "Miss Franklin, I was the guy who played drums tonight. Would you mind taking a photo with me? This was such a monumental experience. If I'd never played drums again, I can actually happily say my career was complete." And she was really sweet. She said that she liked my playing and thanked me for, bailing them out. And then she said, "If I ever need you again, can I call?" And of course I said, "Yeah." And then I split, went back to New York. A few weeks went by and I didn't hear anything, so I figured, oh well. And then the tour manager called up and explained to me that the gig that I had filled in for was the last night of that leg, and that they were just gassing up to do more touring, and Aretha wanted to offer it to me if I was interested in coming out, which I took it. So the blessing was, come on, playing with Aretha Franklin. Even though I grew up playing to progressive rock and dreaming of playing with all those people, there were 2 artists that I always practiced to but never dreamed that I could play with, and that was James Brown and Aretha Franklin. So getting that gig number 1 was a real establishing point for me, because it certainly made a lot of people in the industry all of a sudden recognize that, maybe I had a groove instead of just all of these chops,
sure.
which, so that was great. And of course, I got to play Rocksteady. I got to play, Bridge Over Troubled Water and Respect. Every night I was on stage just looking up and saying, I can't believe that I'm here. This is really just exactly where I've always wanted to be. So that was the blessing. The curse was, and it was an immature thing on my part, was going back to playing with some of the people that I was also used to playing with was very difficult and very unfulfilling as opposed to, 2 or 3 years before. And I'm sure my attitude going back to Joe when I first went back to him, probably wasn't the best. And it took me a while to snap out of it and just say to myself how incredibly lucky I was to do that, and that it's just one more trophy that I need to put on my shelf, and that every gig that I play is a trophy of a different sort, and to just respect what Aretha was all about and don't look down on any other gig, and think that anything else is below her. So that was amazing. It really was. And there aren't many times throughout my career that I've had the highs that I had playing with her and playing with that South African band, which was called Scully at the time, and a few other things. But, you take everything for what they're worth, and you make the best out of all of them, and you put your best into them. So that's the best way to sum up working with Aretha.
Can you sum up the feeling of stepping on stage with a legend with nothing but a stack of charts?
It was so intimidating that it wasn't intimidating. It was so surreal because it was, so real.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and the charts, for not to put a feather in my cap, but the charts were no easy charts. But again, that goes back to me working with Gary Chaffee back when I graduated high school and studied with him, because when I went to Gary, of course, my dream was set on playing for Zappa. And, for really going down the road, or, dreaming of going down the road that Vinny had gone down. But that really was my goal, was to play for Frank Zappa. But when I showed up at Chaffee's and we got to know each other, and I started going through all of his material, I remember saying to him one day, look, I want you to get me ready to play with whatever the first pro gig that comes along, or whether it's Joni Mitchell, Mahavishnu, Madonna, or Motley Crue. I just want to be ready for it. And so sight reading was a big part of my lessons with Gary, as well as, pop and funk and swing and Latin and rock and fatback and everything. That's why I ended up going to 3 lessons a week for a solid 6 months. So it was, it wasn't a frightening experience, but it was definitely, I was firing on all cylinders because I had to. But there's a road map that you use when you're reading charts that you don't really know well. Because I do a lot of jingle work as well, a lot of TV, and those things you read the chart for about 2 minutes, and then you make your notes, you play it down once, which is recorded. The producer then says, change this measure, change this hit, don't do this, take these 4 bars out, and then you do it one more time. And if you didn't get it, then you don't do jingles anymore. And so, you don't literally read every note on the page, although I have had charts like that. And when it is that complex, they usually give you, 2 or 3 more minutes. But, you open up Aretha's chart, and of course I was reading horn charts. I was reading most of the horns and the piano charts, because that's what they had, that the conductor had for me, because the drummer that didn't show up had his book. But anyway, you look at it and you mark off the things that are very important. The tempo and the feel of the tune, where your repeat bars are, where your coda is. Do you have any horn hits that you need to nail? Whatever those little road signs are, you take a yellow Sharpie and you outline them. And so sometimes, you're just playing 32 bars and you don't really have to read the chart. And you're in the 4th bar, and you can see that in bar number 35, you've got a rest and then a couple of hits on the horn. So you actually know a minute already in advance what you're going to do. So as long as you have those tools, which Chaffee did prepare me with, it's doable. It's definitely doable. And the more you do it, like any language, the more you can speak quickly and eloquently and fluently. And I just did it a lot, especially in New York. There was a lot of lot of chart reading when I got down there and started doing sessions.
And did you ever find out why you got the call in the first place?
I did actually, yeah. Her bass player and drummer at the time were also playing with, I want to say it was Marilyn McCoo. I think, was that the woman that used to sing with the Fifth Dimension?
Oh boy, you got me there.
Yeah, it was. I'm pretty sure it was Marilyn McCoo, and they were both also playing with her. And either they had a gig booked. Well, they did. They had a gig booked with Marilyn, and then either Aretha booked another gig and they didn't know about it, or they double booked it accidentally. And the only thing I heard was that I don't want to speak for anybody, but they were trying to negotiate playing for Aretha rather than playing with Marilyn, and Aretha wasn't going to have it. So, her gig came first all the time, or forget it. And that's actually the reason why I guess you could say I lost the gig with her, because when Satriani called me back to go on the road in '95, which was going to be a year plus long tour, so it was a lot of money. I agreed to go back with Joe. And then maybe a month before we were going out, or 2 months before we were going out, Aretha's tour manager called up and said, we have more dates. And I took the dates and I said, oh, this is great, but I can't do the last 2 or 3 because I'm going out on tour with Satriani. And, he was nice about it. He said, okay, let me see what's going to happen. I'll get back to you. And he called me back and he said, Aretha would like one drummer for the whole leg, but if she can't get one guy, then you'll do everything but the last few dates. And as, circumstance would have it, she ended up getting Bernard Purdie back, one of her original drummers. And they did kind of a little all-star reunion tour, I guess. And that was it. I never got called again, which is okay. I would have loved to play it again, but I was gone for about a year. But I'm still very friendly, with her son Teddy, who's her guitar player, and I've bumped into Aretha a couple of times. She's very pleasant, and a few of the other guys. So it was an absolute win-win experience for me, no doubt about it.
And you said that you were surprised that you got the call in the first place and you thought that they had the wrong person. Why was it you they called?
Oh, it was me because it was Arista Records and GTR was on Arista. And so when she called up Clive Davis and said, I'm stuck in Boston, I need a drummer, Clive, because we were, we had done so much with with GTR and whatever, he just said, Jonathan Mover's in New York. And so that guy, Andrew Holt, called me up. And yeah, I definitely thought it was a mistake of names, because Jonathan Moffat, I don't know if you know who he is, but Jonathan Moffat and I used to get mixed up a lot. People would come up to me and say, oh man, I heard, on that Madonna record you're killing. And then people would go up to Jonathan and say, oh, I heard you playing with Satriani, it's amazing. And we used to just laugh that everybody would make, the mistake. So I figured it was an honest mistake that they were looking for Moffat, but fortunately they weren't.
Well done getting a recommendation from Clive Davis.
Yeah, he was a big fan of GTR. That was very nice of him. Yes, I agree.
Okay, so it's late 90s and you've moved on from Satriani. Is it Fuel that comes along next?
Yes, actually. I was doing sessions throughout. I left London in '89 and I moved to New York in the summer of '89, and that's right before when I ended up doing the South African tour, and then into Alice Cooper, and then into Joe. So I moved in June of '89. 2 weeks later, I was on a flight to Moscow, and I didn't stop until I believe it was Christmas of '90. So I was on the road for about 18 months around the world 2.5 times. And I got back to New York and I settled in for a bit. I finally, even though I was living there for 2 years, I could finally say, okay, I'm here. And then the next thing I know, I was now starting to work with Aretha. And, I at the end of that Satriani, the last tour that I did, which was the middle '90s, '96, I had missed an awful lot of sessions because I would get in on something. And I remember I was actually in Spain with Satriani on that '95, '96 tour. And I had done a record for RCA Records. It never came out, but there was a band called Company of Thieves, I think it was called, a Band of Thieves, Company of Thieves, something like that. And it was kind of a Bon Jovi-ish rock record. Jimmy Braylauer, excellent producer and actually drum programmer, was doing it at the power station in New York. And so I got called just for the session, and I was knocking the tracks out, and I had noticed there was a guy standing in the doorway with a beard and mustache watching me. And I was excited to be working with Jimmy Braylauer because, he was a bit of a legend himself. But I walked in after doing, a few songs, and Braylauer looked at me and said, "Man, you're going to be the new guy of New York City." And I said, "Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad you're pleased with me. I'm looking forward to doing more with you, too." And he said, No. That guy that was in the window watching you was Russ Titleman." And my jaw dropped. I mean, Russ has done the biggest records in the world, from Clapton, Elton John, Billy Joel, everybody. And, they gave Russ my number. And, actually, Russ said, "Here's my information, have Mover call tomorrow." So I called the next day, and I gave his, assistant all my info. And then I didn't hear anything for a year. And then I was on the road with Satriani, and I had missed 2 calls on that 95-96 tour. The first one, which was extremely disappointing, was for Joe Jackson. And I'm a huge Joe Jackson fan. Yeah, I mean, when I found out that I missed that one, I was pretty bummed. And then the next one was Titleman's office called to do something in the studio with Julio Iglesias, and I missed it. And that was really kind of one of a few factors that made me, put an end to that tour and not continue on to what Joe did called G3. And so at that point, I decided to stay at home, and I had done a solo record, a little side project I had called Einstein, which was a little vanity project that I had a ball with. And yeah, I started to get a few sessions, but I would say the first really good freelance session that came along, which began the relationship that I had with Sony, was Fuel. And I guess that was 97. Yeah, and I did their record as a session guy. They had a drummer in the band, but I did the record, and things weren't working out with the drummer. And so I then got on their first tour, and I had a ball with them while they were looking for a guy to join the band. And I'm friendly with all of them ever since. Brett Scallions and I, the lead singer, are great pals, and we've actually written a bunch of tunes together, and we've done a few different projects. And yeah, that was a great gig. And it was Stephen Hagler that was producing the record, and then I went on to work with Stephen on other projects. Oleander was another record that I did with him. So it was, all in all, it was a wonderful experience. And yeah, so Fuel was probably the first big one outside of Joe.
How did you get involved with Matt Kramer for his solo album?
Matt, well, actually, it was Saigon Kick, really. And I don't know if you know that I just did their shows last week in Florida.
Oh, I know, yep.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I definitely want to get to that too, but I'm assuming that the Saigon Kick relationship comes back to the Matt Kramer record you did.
No, it doesn't. No. It's way before then.
There you go.
In 1990 or 91 in New York, I was doing some sessions out, and I was friendly with one of the artist relations guys over at Atlantic, Dave Feld, who's still a great pal of mine today. And so I was in Dave's office one day for, I don't remember what reason, and he said, "I got to play you this band that I want to sign." Excuse me. And he actually played me the demo or whatever he had from Saigon. And I immediately fell for it. I just said, "These guys are great. I love it. Can I have a copy of the demo? You got to keep me informed as to what's happening." And then the record came out, and they were playing in New York. And I was in the studio working, so I couldn't actually make the date. And I believe it was a day or two later, they were playing up in Boston. And so I jumped in my car or on my Harley or something, and I rode all the way to Boston, like 4 or 5 hours, just to see them and meet them in person the next night, just because I was a fan. And I became good pals, good friends with everybody. And that led to Matt asking me to record on his War and Peas record. And we ended up we did the drums in Skyline, my studio in New York, and then he mixed it there as well. And, again, whenever I would be in Florida visiting my parents or on tour doing something, I'd always call Matt or Phil when he was down there, and we'd get together. And I did some dates with Matt live, and then about 6 months ago or so, he was producing a Floridian, and he wanted me to play on half the record. And so I did the sessions down in Florida with him. And the funny thing was, I hadn't seen Saigon in ages, and I hadn't seen Phil, the drummer, in a long time. And, we used to be pretty tight, and, he's out in Vegas doing his thing, and we're just busy. And so, as it turned out, a couple of weeks ago was my parents' 62nd anniversary, and they retired down in Boynton Beach. And so I was on my way down to visit them, and I was speaking to Dave Feld, who signed Saigon, and he lives down there, and he said, "Oh, guess what? Saigon's got 2 gigs the week that you're going to be here." And I said, "Great, don't tell Phil. I want to come and surprise everybody." And then about, a month ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago, I got the phone call or text message from Matt saying, "We heard you're going to be down. Can you do these 2 shows?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." And then the first thing I did was call Phil and left him a message because he didn't pick up. And I just said, I heard that you, have left, and they've asked me to fill in, which I'm happy to do and looking forward to it. Just want to make sure that everything is cool with you, and we're all good, which of course I knew he would say it was all good. And that was it. And I loved it. I really had a great time playing with them because, again, aside from liking them all as well, it's only Matt and Jason. I knew I had just met Stephen Gibb, the rhythm guitar player, and the other Jason, the bass player, and we all got on great. But aside from being friendly with them for all those years, I am a very big fan of, actually, I was going to say Saigon. The first 2 Saigon Kick records, I don't think I have the 3rd or the 4th one, because after Matt split, I kind of lost touch with them. But it was a blast playing that music. I really had a good time. And we're going to do some more stuff, so I'm looking forward to it. And I think everybody's in a great place because there are some offers out there to do some work, but nobody wants to go out and, quote unquote, tour, in that act, in that position. Nobody's going to hit the road for 8 weeks or something like that, but we might do, little weeks or weekends here and there, or maybe do a couple of weeks in Europe or something in Asia has been talked about. But I think it's great because everybody's on board, that nobody wants to pack up and jump on a tour bus for 3 or 4 months doing clubs. So I think it's going to be a really nice relationship for whatever happens and however far it goes.
Think you can convince them to do some new music?
We did talk about it, actually. Yeah, we had 2 very quick rehearsals, which were really just running through the framework of everything. We didn't have the opportunity that I think everybody would like to have, which is to really get into a rehearsal room and go through some new arrangements, tighten some things up, and have some fun, throw some curveballs in there. But along the few days that we were hanging together, Jason, Matt, and I were rapping about, let's do some stuff from here. And we did. We talked about getting together and throwing some riffs around and maybe coming up with something, yeah. And they're both really amazing. I mean, Jason is not only an incredible guitar player, he really is an incredible writer. And, Matt is a great frontman and a vocalist. And I think I'm just glad that whatever they had in the past that separated the 2 of them is now, way in the past. And they get along like best friends. It was great hanging out to see them like that because even in the very early days, I never really saw that camaraderie. So I think there's the makings are there for something nice to happen.
Yeah, you can tell in the way that they're doing this, that they do a few select shows. They're that it's clearly not a cash grab. They're doing it for the right reasons.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, but there is definitely there is somewhere to go with it. To go out there and to do select shows, but to do more select shows and not have it turn into a Spinal Tap, if you know what I mean. But on the other hand, not invest so much that, if a record doesn't come out and sells 500,000, which is probably never going to happen, there's no disappointment. And I think everybody's on the same page that it would be a lot of fun to just continue to do some great spot shows here and there. And if a nice little run of 10 days or 3 weeks comes up to go overseas or something, then we'll take advantage of it. But that's more their call than mine, of course.
Sure. And that would make a ton of sense because of the following they have, especially they have an Asian following that's just massive.
They do, and that's something that I kind of heard, squeaks and squawks about years ago, that they were still able to go over there. So that would be great. I learned a long time ago with Marillion, especially doing that live show that I did in Germany with them. Nobody in America knew who they were. Literally, they didn't even have a record out as an import here, which was 1982, I think. A Script from a Jester's Tear came out, their first record. And all of a sudden I found myself in Germany playing to, quite a few thousand people that were going crazy. And, getting back to London and going out to a few parties and being treated like a, quote unquote rock star. And then finding myself, out at Rockfield Studios in Wales, where some of the biggest records, including Rush, recorded there. And that's when I really realized that there's a whole world out there beyond America. Of course, it's wonderful to play at home and to be successful at home. But believe me, I mean, there's nothing wrong with going over and playing great shows in Japan or great shows in Australia, or doing the Eastern Bloc, Bulgaria, Hungary, all Romania. There's amazing crowds over there where they love what you do. They respect the fact that you come all the way there to play for them, and it doesn't matter to me what territory I'm on, as long as I'm playing great music with good musicians and to great crowds.
And let's talk a bit more about today in terms of your magazine. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, Drumhead Magazine. I kind of fell into it with no intentions at all of ever wanting to own or have my own magazine, the same way that I ended up with one of New York's biggest recording studios. The studio thing happened very quickly because a couple of guys that I was doing some work with approached me about helping them do a studio and being a silent partner. And I got them up and running and off the ground, and they ended up folding. And I was offered the opportunity to take it over and to move forward, which I did. I never dreamed or I never wanted to own a studio, but I ended up there for about 17 years. And the same thing happened with the magazine. I was approached by a team, an American and a German, that were in the publishing business. The German guy was in the publishing business in Europe, and he wanted to establish a publishing company to do magazines and books in the States. And when the two of them got together and talked about it, they both agreed that there were too many guitar magazines and too many tech magazines, that maybe the best way to break in would be a drum magazine. And actually, by way of my little brother, one of the guys, the American guy, met my little brother, recognized his last name, and said, are you any relationship to Jonathan Mover? And my brother said, yeah, he's my brother. And the guy who also played guitar said, I've got all the records your brother's played on. I'm a guitarist. I've seen him play live so many times. I would love to meet your brother. I didn't realize that he was, not just a fan, I guess you could say, but he also wanted to meet me to investigate the possibilities of me being involved in the magazine. So we got together and, started talking about all sorts of music things. And in one way or another, he brought it up and said, what do you think of the American drum magazines? And I, kind of politely or impolitely said, I'm not, yeah, they're no good. I don't read them. And the reason I don't read them is because they don't really they don't give me any information that is either real, useful, or educational. And I just, once I became, professional, and especially once I was owning the studio, I was really seeing so much more of the truth of the industry. And a lot of magazines, not just drum magazines, but, a lot of magazines don't talk about the truth of the industry. They don't tell you who's really on the record. They don't tell you why somebody was replaced. They don't tell you, the bad stuff, which is really, in my opinion, even the more interesting stuff that makes everybody real and human. So I just said to him, and he said to me, well, what would you do if you had your own magazine? And right off the top of my head, I said I would have a magazine based on education. I would have long-form interviews that told the truth about the industry. I would have notation and music, and I would get the writers for the magazine would all have to be professional drummers or musicians that know the real deal. And that's what I would do. And he, unbeknownst to me, he went back and spoke to the German guy, and then the German guy flew to New York. We all went to dinner, and they told me what they were doing, and they said, we want you to be the editor-in-chief and be a partner. And I said, thank you, but no thank you. I don't know anything about publishing, I'm a drummer, leave me alone, but I'll give you my idea, I'll sell it, or you can pay me to be a consultant. And the short story is they started interviewing a lot of people for the job and kept on calling me back, saying that we don't think anybody can do the job that you can do because of your passion and knowledge and your idea, your vision. And I finally said, fly me to Munich and let me spend a week in your facility. Let me go department to department and see exactly what it takes to put together an issue of a magazine. And at the end of the week, I'll either find somebody to do it for you, or I'll tell you that I can do it myself. And so at the end of the week, I told them I can do this for you. And so, the first company that did it was the two of them with me. And as in many business situations, it didn't take long for the two of them to, like Howe and Hackett, find a division. And then the German guy ended up out, and it was myself and the American. And it didn't take long for me to find that the American guy wasn't above board. And so I guess it's just about a year now. I just, put my foot down one day and I said, you, and you're gone. And from what I know that's been going on, don't bother trying to, argue with me, or it's going to get ugly. I now own the magazine 100%, and I will do it on my own terms, and I will find, the people I need to do it with. And it was just an unbelievable stroke of luck that I ended up meeting a drummer in a juice bar in LA when I was out there doing a record with some of the guys from Alice Cooper. And she approached me because I had a Pearl t-shirt, and she said, you play Pearl? And I said, yeah. And she said, oh, I got an early 60s round badge Gretsch. And I said, well, your drums beat mine. I mean, that's a beauty. And we got to talking. She's an engineer and a producer, and she was managing and booking one of LA's longest running studios. And in the back of my head, as I was talking to her, I said, this would be the perfect girl to be my new managing editor. And before I could even open my mouth to offer to her, she said, I'm really interested in talking to you about your magazine. One thing led to another, and I'm very happy to say that she has helped me turn the magazine. Well, it was doing well, but she helped me take it to a level that is just amazing. In the past, I would say to the other people that I was working with, I would say, we should be doing this, and how come we can't do this? And then a couple of days later, the answer would come back and say, oh, we looked into it, you can't do it, for this reason, for that reason, whatever. With this girl, Genevieve, I say, maybe we should try this. And within 3 hours, it's done. And our distribution is expanded to other countries in much larger numbers, and our subscriptions are going through the roof. And before I can even open my mouth, she's calling me saying, I've got this idea for this, this, and this. And the next thing you know, we've just sold 1,000 more copies. So it took about 10 years almost to get there, but it's the right team with me and her, and we're seriously kicking ass, and I'm very happy with it.
Obviously, the print business is a tough one nowadays.
It is a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
What strategies are you incorporating to adapt with the times then?
No bullshit. And I'm
Yeah.
serious about that. And it's the same thing with why my recording studio did so well. I didn't screw any of my clientele. The people that came into my studio got a musician's deal. I didn't watch the clock like a hawk. I always maintained the place and had everything in great working condition. Unlike other studios that were charging $50 to burn a DVD and $25 for a CD for songs or data, I charged $1 for a DVD, and most of the times I gave away CDs. So I just always wanted people to be happy, and I always wanted it to be a very honest working situation, and most of the times it was. It was the same thing with the magazine. When I first told some people in the industry that I was going to do this, a lot of people said, oh, wow, that's really great. Love the idea. Love that you're going to do it. A real professional drummer that knows the ins and the outs of the industry. There is no other magazine like that. But other people came back and said, oh, great, just what we need, another drum magazine. And I said, actually, no, it's not just another drum magazine. It's different. And I'm going to give people what I would want the magazine to give me. And I've never had that. I mean, I got a bit of it back in the 70s and 80s, but things kind of just, fell by the wayside with some of the other magazines. And so it was really simple. It's just, it's like when I interview somebody, I might be a colleague or peer of Terry Bozzio's, but I'm also a huge fan. So not only does he open up to me like I'm a friend and I'm a colleague, but I can ask all of the questions to Terry that I always wanted to know as a fan. And there's a real passion there because no matter who I sit down with and speak to, I'm like a little kid. I mean, when I met Jim Keltner, it took me a minute to speak, and my cover story with Bozzio was a 9.5-hour interview. My cover story with Simon Phillips was 6 hours. Jim Keltner was 4 hours. I mean, it's not a 5-page interview. Bozzio was 26 pages long. I think Keltner was 20. Simon Phillips was 24. Antonio Sanchez was on the new cover. I think his is 16. I mean, it's just long form, and there's so much great information. And the guys will talk to me about what they won't talk about with somebody else. So things come out in other magazines that don't come out in mine, and vice versa. Because the last thing that we're going to talk about is, why did you choose this color for your drum kit, and what heads are you using on your toms? Yeah, that might be in there somewhere, but we're going to talk more about, why'd you lose this gig, or how did you do that drum track? Was it 1 take? Was it 30 takes? Did you like what the producer did? How come you didn't do the tour, but you did the record? How come you're in the band, but you're not on the record? So all of that type of stuff that a lot of people just won't talk about. And that's the stuff that we get to. So it really is a very different magazine. And we get a lot of people reading it that aren't even drummers because they love the stories. You learn about the life and the lifestyle and the career of the drummer. You don't just learn about what he played on a particular song or what drum kit he chose.
That makes a lot of sense to me because I don't think even like guitar magazines, bass magazines, none of them do the long form interviews, but
nobody does.
Nobody does that. And nowadays with the internet, you can find all the superficial stuff very easily, but to get that level of depth, that's difficult. Now you're giving them something new.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. What does the future look like for the magazine?
Well, it's doing really well. I mean, our print is expanding. We're printing more and more issues every issue. More copies are going out. And the distribution is expanding. The digital version is doing very well. And we now have it in app form. And so we've got people that are using it on iPhones and iPads and all of that stuff. So, I mean, I'm just going to continue going with it as we grow. There's all sorts of possibilities. Right now, I'm only 6 issues per year. Because it would be impossible for me to do any more than that. I have a lot of requests from people that they would like to see 9 or 12 issues, but I couldn't do that without a real crew. But because of what Genevieve has, my managing editor, because of what she's brought to the table, and financially now the success that we're having, I think it's very possible that in the not too distant future, I am going to be able to look to expand that way and do that. So. It's all, upwards from here. Everything is looking really great. More and more companies are coming in for advertising, and we're actually putting money back in. Speaking for myself, our page quality of paper is very good. We're a little bit larger in size. The stock that we buy is excellent, and the other magazines, because of the industry, not just the drum magazines, but a lot of the other magazines have gone down in grade, paper-wise. And they're just saving money in a lot of places that we're not. We're actually putting money back in because I don't want to put anything out that's inferior to what I would want for myself. And I think the people and our readers appreciate that.
That was Jonathan Mover. I hope you enjoyed it. Well, like every other podcast out there, now's the time that I'm going to beg you to do an iTunes review. It really does help the rankings. And if you want to support the show, I have Amazon and iTunes affiliate links up at thedoubletop.com. If you want to buy from those stores, my show gets a little cut. Well, that's it for this week. Join me again next week when I'll have an interview with Ronnie James Dio's favorite recording engineer.